Somewhere in the Babylonian Talmud, one of the most respected rabbis in Jewish history makes a claim that should sound impossible. Before Adam, he says, there were 974 generations, not 974 years, not 974 people, 974 entire generations, enough time by some calculations for tens of thousands of years of human-like beings to live and die and vanish before the man named Adam ever opened his eyes in a garden. That claim isn't from a skeptic. It isn't from a modern scientist trying to reconcile Genesis with the fossil record. It's sitting inside one of the most sacred texts in Judaism, studied by rabbis for over 1,000 years. And it's not alone. Ancient Jewish mysticism speaks of entire worlds, created by God and then destroyed, before the world we live in now existed. Medieval Jewish folklore describes a woman who came before Eve, who was cast out of Eden for refusing to submit. Islamic tradition holds that another kind of being altogether, the Jinn, ruled the earth for 2,000 years before Adam ever set foot on it and had to be driven back by armies of angels. And even inside the Bible itself, no apocrypha required, careful readers have noticed for centuries that Genesis seems to tell the story of the first human being not once but twice in two accounts that don't quite line up. So today we're asking a question that sounds like heresy, but is really just curiosity. Was Adam really the first human being on earth? And if the answer isn't a simple yes, what were people across 3,000 years of religious history actually trying to explain? Part 1. The Bible's own double story. Let's start with the text most people think they already know. Open Genesis and you'll find creation described twice, back to back, and the two versions don't move in the same order. In Genesis chapter 1, God creates in a clear, cosmic sequence: light, sky, sea, land, plants, sun and moon, sea creatures, birds, land animals, and then, on the sixth day, humanity. Not one person, humanity. Genesis 1:27 says God created Adam, and in Hebrew that word doesn't mean a man's personal name yet. It means humankind. The verse goes on to specify, male and female, he created them, plural, together, as a population, not a couple. Then turn the page. Genesis chapter 2 begins telling the story again, and this time everything is different. There's no water yet. The earth is dry. There are no plants yet because there's no rain and no one to work the ground. And then, in that empty waiting landscape, God forms one single man from the dust, breathes life into him, and only afterward plants a garden around him, brings him animals to name, and finally builds a woman out of his side. Scholars have debated this for centuries. Some see two authors from two different eras whose accounts were later stitched together by an editor. Others see one story told in two different lenses, a wide-angle cosmic overview followed by a close-up on one important garden. But even scholars who defend the unity of Genesis admit something curious sits right at the seam. Chapter 1 gives us a population formed simultaneously, ruling over creation as a group. Chapter 2 gives us a single individual, formed alone in a specific place for a specific purpose, which raises a strange, quiet question that Jewish tradition would eventually run with for centuries. What if these aren't describing the same event at all? What if the Adam of chapter 1, the collective humanity spread across the whole earth, came first, and the Adam of chapter 2, formed alone in one particular garden, was something else? Not the first human being ever to exist, but the first one placed in relationship with God? It's a small crack in the text, but ancient readers pushed their fingers into it and entire traditions grew out from underneath. Part 2. The worlds before this one. Jewish mysticism didn't just notice the crack, it built a cosmology out of it. The Zohar, the foundational text of Kabbalah, points to a strange passage tucked away in Genesis chapter 36. A list of kings who ruled the land of Edom before any king reigned over the Israelites. On its surface, it's just a genealogy, easy to skip past. But the Kabbalists read it as a code. Each king in that list dies and is replaced, but not by his own son, No dynasty, no continuity, just death, and a stranger taking the throne, over and over. To the mystics, that pattern of collapse was the clue. They read it as a hidden memory of primordial worlds, worlds God built before this one, using pure, unbalanced judgment with no mercy to soften it, worlds so severe they couldn't hold together and shattered one after another. Only when God finally balanced judgment with mercy, the tradition says, could a stable world, our world, take shape. In that stable form, the Kabbalists taught was represented by the coming of Adam. There's an even older rabbinic saying that expresses the same idea more simply. God created worlds and destroyed them, saying, "This one pleases me, that one does not please me." It appears in classical midrash, centuries before Kabbalah gave it a name. And then there's the number that opened this episode, 974. The Talmud, in more than one place, describes 974 generations that pressed themselves forward to be created before the world existed. Generations God chose to hold back, to erase, before finally allowing Adam's line, and eventually the Torah, to arrive 26 generations later. Rabbis have debated for 1,000 years exactly what that means. Some treat it as pure mysticism, a way of talking about time before time, with no physical reality attached. But others read it more literally. One 19th century rabbinic commentator, writing decades before the word paleontology existed, connected those 974 generations directly to the prehistoric human remains beginning to surface in his era, suggesting that ancient rabbis had, in their own symbolic language, already made room for a very old, very crowded prehistory before the man named Adam. None of this was fringe speculation kept in the margins. This is the Talmud. This is the Zohar. This is some of the most central literature in all of Jewish tradition. And it's telling us, in its own careful language, that Adam might not have been the beginning of the story. He might have been the first chapter that finally held together. Part 3, The Woman Before Eve. If Adam wasn't necessarily the first human, Jewish folklore also wondered about something else. Was Eve really the first woman? That's where Lilith enters the story. Not from the Bible itself, but from a strange, satirical medieval Jewish text called the Alphabet of Ben Sira, written somewhere between the 8th and 10th centuries. And notice something important before we even get to her story. The text exists specifically because of the same double creation puzzle we already found in Genesis. If chapter 1 says God created male and female together, and chapter 2 says Eve was built later, from Adam's side, the medieval mind wanted to know, what happened to the female from the first version? The Alphabet of Ben Sira supplies an answer. Before Eve, it says, God made Lilith the same way he made Adam, from the earth as his equal. And equal is exactly the problem. When Adam insisted he should lie above her during intimacy, Lilith refused, telling him plainly, "We are equal to each other, since we are both from the earth." Neither would yield. So Lilith spoke the secret name of God, grew wings, and flew out of Eden entirely, choosing exile over submission. God sent 3 angels after her, with orders to bring her back or else. She refused both. In her final defiance, she declared that if she couldn't return as Adam's equal, she would become something else instead. A threat to infants and mothers in childbirth, forever haunting the very domestic life she'd been expected to accept. It's worth being honest about what this text actually is. The Alphabet of Ben Sira is widely understood by scholars as satire, a biting, sometimes crude commentary on rabbinic culture, not a solemn theological claim. It carried little serious weight for centuries after it was written, but the character it invented didn't stay contained. Lilith crept into later Kabbalah as a dark spiritual force. She crept into folk amulets that Jewish parents hung over cradles for 1,000 years to protect their children from her. And in the 20th century, she was rediscovered again, this time by feminist scholars who read her refusal to lie beneath Adam not as demonic pride, but as one of the oldest recorded declarations of equality in Western religious literature. Whatever Lilith originally was, satire, superstition, or something else, she reveals the same instinct we keep finding throughout this whole story. Ancient readers looked at their own scripture, noticed a gap, and built an entire figure to live inside it. Part 4. Who was on earth before Adam, according to Islam? Judaism isn't the only tradition with a "someone was already here" story. Islamic tradition tells one too, and this one doesn't involve other humans. It involves the Jinn. According to a well-known account traced back to Ibn Abbas, one of the earliest and most respected interpreters of the Quran, the Jinn were the first inhabitants of the earth. Not humans at all, but beings made from smokeless fire, ruling the world for roughly 2,000 years before Adam existed. And their reign, according to the tradition, wasn't peaceful. They spread corruption. They shed each other's blood. Eventually, God sent Iblis, at that point still counted among the righteous, worshiping alongside the angels, leading an army of angels down to earth to subdue them, driving the surviving Jinn back to the mountains and remote islands. This is the same Iblis who, later in the story everyone knows, refuses to bow to the newly created Adam, not out of nothing, but according to some interpretations, out of a bitterness that had already been building. He had fought for the earth once, cleared it of chaos, and considered himself superior, made from fire rather than clay. When God commanded him to prostrate before this new creature formed from mud, Iblis's refusal wasn't just arrogance in a vacuum. In this reading, it was the resentment of someone who believed he had already earned his place, only to watch it handed to someone else. It's worth noting Islamic scholarship is genuinely divided on how literally to take the 2,000-year Jinn kingdom. Some hadith scholars consider elements of that specific chronology unreliable, even while accepting the broader, well-attested idea that Iblis was Jinn, not angel, and that the Jinn existed as a distinct order of creation. But the core shape of the tradition persists across centuries of Islamic exegesis. Before the being called Adam, the earth already had inhabitants, and the fall of the greatest of them may have started with a memory of a kingdom he used to rule alone. Part 5, when this became a weapon. Here's where the story takes a darker turn, and it's important not to skip past it. In 1655, a French theologian named Isaac Lapeyrère published a book called Pre-Adamites, pre-Adamites, arguing, using Paul's letter to the Romans as his springboard, that Adam couldn't have been the first human on earth at all. Lapeyrère proposed that Adam was specifically the ancestor of the Jewish people, while entire other populations, Gentiles, descended from earlier, pre-Adamic humans who were already scattered across the world. The Catholic Church condemned the book immediately. Lapeyrère was arrested and forced to publicly recant, but the idea didn't die. It mutated. Over the following 2 centuries, as European explorers and colonizers encountered peoples across Africa, Asia, and the Americas who looked, to their eyes, strikingly different from themselves, a minority of Christian thinkers reached back for Lapeyrére's discarded theory and gave it an ugly new purpose. If non-European peoples were descended from separate, lesser pre-Adamic stock rather than from Adam himself, the reasoning went, then the Bible's account of one shared humanity simply didn't apply to them. This became one of the theological justifications historically used to defend slavery and racial hierarchy, a genuine, documented, and shameful chapter in how this idea was weaponized. That history matters because it's a sharp reminder that the same ancient question, was Adam really first, can be asked with real curiosity, the way the rabbis asked it, or it can be twisted into something that serves cruelty. The instinct to wonder isn't the problem. What people choose to build on top of that wonderings. Part 6. What do we do with all of this? So where does that leave us? Mainstream Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have never treated any of these traditions, the 974 generations, the shattered worlds of Kabbalah, Lilith, the Jinn kingdoms, as required belief. They sit in a different category from Scripture itself. Commentary, mysticism, folklore, philosophy, respected, studied, argued over for 1,000 years, but optional. And yet look at how consistently the question resurfaces across completely unconnected traditions, separated by centuries and continents, with no evidence any of them were directly copying each other's answer. Jewish sages reading a genealogy of foreign kings and hearing an echo of shattered worlds. Anonymous medieval writers filling the silence around Eve with a woman who chose exile over inequality. Islamic scholars preserving a memory of a fire-born civilization that ruled the earth first and lost it. Modern scholars with no religious agenda at all, simply noticing that Genesis quietly tells its own story twice. Maybe that persistence tells us something. Not necessarily that any one of these traditions is historically true in a literal verifiable sense. That's not a claim any of us can settle from here. But that something about the idea of someone came before the beginning we know keeps proving irresistible to the human imagination across every culture that has ever looked at its own origin story and felt that one clean, tidy answer wasn't quite enough. Because in the end, that might be the real thread connecting all of it. The Talmud's discarded generations, the Zohar's fallen kings, Lilith's flight over the Red Sea, the Jinn's 2,000-year reign, even La Pereire's condemned book. Every single one of them starts in the same place, someone reading their own sacred story closely enough to notice a silence. And instead of walking past it, they stopped and asked the question we're still asking tonight. Now, what if the story doesn't start where we were told it starts?